the top of the hour, so we'll start with our next session. This is going to be the session on denial of service attacks. And we've got three great talks for you, including our Best Paper Award winner, which is going to be the first talk in our session. To present this paper titled New Kids on the DoS Block, fantastic title, by the way, we have Thiago Heinrich. Thiago is a PhD student at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil, and his research interests include network measurement, DRDoS attacks, and intrusion detection. So I think we're ready to start the video.
The spoofing so that response are. Hello, my name is Thiago and I will be presenting new kits on the DRDoS block characterizing multi-protocol and carpet bombing attacks. I will be presenting a brief introduction about the subject, followed by our goal, contribution, and findings. A popular type of DDoS are reflection attack, known as DRDoS attacks. These attacks use IP spoofing so that responses are reflected to the victim. A set of protocol can be used at the same time, and reflection offers an extra layer of indirection and traffic amplification. Recent developments in DRDoS attacks are multi-protocol attacks, where a group of protocols can be used at the same time to send traffic to an address, and carpet bombing attacks that target multiple subnet addresses instead of a single address, with the objective of saturating the network. This makes detection and mitigation difficult. Our research aimed to characterize multi-protocol and carpet bombing DRDoS attack through a honeypot we developed for data collection. Our main contributions are a definition for multi-protocol DRDoS attacks, description of several multi-protocol DRDoS attacks, and comparison with monoprotocol attacks, and characterization of carpet bombing attacks. Our honeypot was designed specifically to be used as a reflector of this type of attacks, supporting a total of 9 protocols, 7 being emulation, and 2 proxies. Since it does not host any public advertised service, the system is only to become a reflector after it has been found. The data collection started in September 2018. During this time, we collected data from Brazilian election and COVID-19. It is necessary to identify attacks and victims, but there's no previous consensus about DRDoS attacks. Of course, considering the point of view of a reflector. Our definition is an adaptation of the group's previous works and aims to embrace this type of attack. Carpet bombing attacks target multiple addresses in the same network, so if we consider that each IP address is separated victim, we risk to inflating the number of victims and attacks and reducing the intensity of these attacks by splitting the traffic volume. So a DRDoS attack is made up of a set of at least 5 requests with a source IP address referring to the same victim and with a maximum spacing of 60 seconds between consecutive requests. A victim is defined by the first 3 octets of source IP address. During 731 days, we processed over 1.8 terabytes of traffic, containing nearly 20.7 billion requests, with an average of 28 million requests per day. But only 7.2 million requests got a reply because of our rate limit rule. We observed nearly 1.4 million DDoS attacks, and we observed a four-fold increase in traffic during the lockdown period from March to June. The picture presents evolution of monthly requests broke down by protocols. We can see that presence of scaled up and charging requests over the months. Overall, duration of attacks observed was shorter than works in literature, with multiple protocol attacks having a bigger duration and a smaller average of package per day considered monoprotocol attacks. This table shows the most frequent combination of protocol used in multi-protocol attacks. Attacks combining charging and sealed up are more numerous, but had less requests than attacks involving other protocols. There were just 230 attacks with more than two protocols being used at the same time. Our studies show that multi-protocol attacks exploit a smaller set of protocol with a varying combination. The figure in the left represents carpet bombing attacks observed. Overall, carpet bombing traffic represents less than 4% of the traffic and less than 6% of the requests, but affect almost 22% of the victims. And the figure in the right presents what we call an attack with antecedents, where the carpet bomb attack occurs after a few days where a single address is targeted each day. We found evidence that multi-protocol attacks are occurring but still in minority. We also studied the recent phenomenon of carpet bombing attacks, describing several of the characteristics, including the powerful combination of multi-protocol and carpet bombing. In future work, we intend to add honeypots in different networks and analyze and correlate their traffic. We already have a collaboration underway, and we welcome other interested researchers to contact us. We had to leave something else of this presentation, but you can find them in the paper, such as evaluation of attacks, duration, and victims, protocol breakdown, and what type of payload is being used. Thank you.
Well, thanks to our speaker, Thiago, for that interesting talk. We've got a few minutes for questions. If you enjoyed the talk, if you have questions for our best paper winner, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A on WebEx. We also have a dedicated Slack channel for this
Thank you
session.
for joining the presentation of our study.
This is session.
Thank you for joining.
This is session 6 in Slack. So feel free to post your questions there. While we are, if you do want to submit your questions, know that if I read them out, of course you are consenting to share them on the recording. So while those questions come in, wanted to start with a maybe an easy question for you, Thiago. So what exactly is the motivation for doing something like a carpet bombing attack instead of a specific target?
The easy answer is carpet bombing is way difficult to get see by someone that is looking this type of traffic in the network. You are not sending the traffic just to one host. You are sending it to a group of machines. So the number of requests that you send to each one of these machines is way lower. This is the main objective of this type of attack. So instead of you sending all your traffic to one host, you will be sending to a group of hosts, and obtaining the same objective.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a question, several questions coming in on the Slack. The first one is from Daniel Kopp, who will incidentally be our speaker for the next talk. He asks, your report on observed amplification factors. Is the amplification factor you observe an artifact of your honeypot implementation? And the follow-up question is, could you share some more details about the implementation of your honeypot?
Okay. First, the amplification factor. The amplification factor in the first implementation that we have, we are not collecting amplification. So we do not get this type of information in real time. Now we are collecting this type of information in real time. So we know the payload they are using and the refactor factor they are getting. In the first 2 months, we are not collecting this type of information. Now we are collecting this type of information. This is the information that is in the paper. We are collecting this type of information in real time. The other question is about implementation. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see.
So
Okay.
Go ahead.
The implementation process was long. We have a previous study in our group. We have other studies that use honeypots, so we have a lot of experience with honeypots. But with this, we have a lot of problems. In my master, I took this topic, and the first point was fix all the problems with a new honeypot. I stayed 6 months working the code. One of the problems was performance. We have a lot of problems with performance that we need to fix. That was the main problem. So we did not want to lose package. We did not want to lose any type of information because of our implementation or because of our host that was collecting this type of information. So we use specific tools to check each protocol and check the performance they are getting. In this process, we are not using rate limits in the tool. So the honeypot was replying every request they were receiving. Of course, it does not have. It just will not happen in the real data collection because we don't want to reply every request we are receiving. Today, we are only replying five requests for each host, each address that he's receiving. We are thinking in reducing this to 3. There's no big impact because of this rate limit in specific. But the implementation was most looking performance and not losing any type of information.
So we've got a couple of other questions from Marcin. I think that's how you pronounce your name. One of the things he asks is, well, he actually asked about the rate limiting, and I believe you just asked that. But his second question is, do you have any intuition about why you see different tracket volumes, such as number of packets for the protocols? Or I think that means across different protocols.
Different protocols. Okay. The main point in having more than one protocol is amplification factor. So over time, you will have protocols like main cached that you can achieve a better reflection factor, so a better amplification. The attackers will explore this, and they are exploring this. But over time, the standards will change. In the last 3 months, we have a change from main cached and charging to CellDAP. We are not expecting that much traffic in charging. It's surprising that we have that much traffic in a protocol so old, and it is problematic. But the main idea in choosing a protocol is the amplification factor. They are checking for this, but in most of the time they're just checking if the port is open, if the port is replying, and I don't have an idea if they are checking the amplification factor that we are achieving. So they can choose between reflectors, which reflector have the better amplification factor. Of course, protocols like charging will have always the same amplification factor. This will just change because of the payload they are using, but the reply message is always the same string.
Well, thanks, Tiago, for the great talk, and congratulations again on the Best Paper Award.
Thank you.
So next up, we've got another great talk on distributed denial of service, and this is going to come to us from our speaker, Daniel Kopp. He's a senior researcher at the German Commercial Internet Exchange, as well as a PhD student at the BTU. So with that, let's see the presentation.
The presentation of our study. So simultaneously, when we sent in the study to the Passive and Active Measurement Conference, a panel discussion appeared at the last conference of the North American Network Operator meeting in October 2020 with the title, Why Do We Still Have DDoS Attacks? So independently, this had almost the same title and the same idea to discuss the continuous prevalence of DDoS attacks. Our study gives an updated and detailed view on DDoS amplification attacks as seen from the perspective of an IXP. So let me start with the contributions. So we start DDoS attacks as seen from a large IXP. This IXP is global visible and focuses on Europe. It features more than 900 connected networks. We give details on amplification protocols that are actually used in the wild. During our study, we noticed that we find often fragmented packets with DDoS attacks. This is nothing new, but in our sample flow traces, we noticed that these flows are port 0. So this might be a new notable insight. Further, the study provides an infrastructure perspective, a view on targets and attack patterns, and a brief comparison as seen of attacks by honeypots. So how does our classification work? So we focus on known amplification protocols. Here you see MTP servers, and we say that it's very unlikely that you see high traffic volumes from these type of protocols and servers to a single target. So in more details, our classification works as follows. If a target receives more than 1 gigabit of traffic, which is a very, very high filter criterion, but we wanted to have as low as false positives as possible. This is the first filter criterion. The second is it has to be from more than 10 sources. And the third is it has to come from a known amplification protocol. So first glance from our results, we see for really old and well-known protocols, they account for almost 90% of all attacks that we have seen. This is NTP, DNS, and CLDAP. So this is the majority. This is used in attacks today. Also, we find that memcached, even though it has been known for a while and it also crippled some provider networks, is again noticeable used in DDoS attacks. We also noticed that the simple service discovery protocol poses some really high potential DDoS attacks. We noticed that this might be really used for sophisticated attacks and long attacks. So the longest attacks that we recorded, that was 7 days, used an SSDP protocol. It can provide really high packet rates and really high traffic volumes, even though it's not the most used protocol in our dataset. So also we have a lot of not so known and less frequent protocols, but they doesn't have to be undermated because you can see that they can also provide a very high traffic volume. This is here shown by the blue dots. They can be very high. So they can generate severe traffic rates even though they are not used a lot. And our study shows they are all already actually used in the wild. So onto new protocols, we noticed the most important for OpenVPN. So OpenVPN rose in our observation period by 500%. If you put this into contrast to all the other protocols that can be seen like 1,000 attacks on a weekly basis, And compared to OpenVPN, which you see like in areas, or which we saw in areas between 50 and 100, it's still still small. But still, it can provide high traffic volumes and packet rates, so it can grow and can become a potential problem. So then we take a look onto traffic volume to packet rate. So we find a linear relationship for the traffic volume to the packet rate. And we looked into the packet rate because for some networks or devices in the internet, this is an important factor because they might cope with the traffic volume, but the packet rate might be too high. So interestingly, here we see linear relationship, which meant that the amplification factor of the protocol is the same. But then we also find multilinear relationships, which means that this protocol, in this case, VWS Discovery, might have two different amplification flaws that admit different amplification vectors. And third, we find nonlinear relationships, which is the case for memcached. That means that it will admit a variable size of payload. That might be more difficult to defend because the packet size will vary. So we take also a look onto the infrastructure perspective in the IXP. So here you can see the attacks on customer ports at the IXP, and the red line means the customer port have been saturated by 100%. So luckily only for 0.18% of the attacks, they exceed 100% of the port capacity. But because there might be also traffic, we also checked for lower levels. And so for 26% of the attacks, we find a port for the port capacity of 50%. We also wondered what was the biggest amount of traffic that the IXP ever has to cope with during our observation period. And we found that the biggest traffic was 3.6% of the IXP's overall peak traffic. So this is well into safety levels, but one have to keep into mind that core infrastructure and backbone providers, they have to transmit like a lot of DDoS attacks in parallel, and it might add up. So we also take a look onto the targets. So here we find some noticeable attack that I don't know, I think it has never been described before as far as I know. So here we see a temporal attack. Each dot is a 1-minute attack, and it traverses a victims/25 network. So the attacker changes the IP address every 1 minute, and then it goes into a loop and accounts it at 4 and 4. So this is probably done to evade mitigation tactics, because the mitigation software might need some time to recognize there is an actual DDoS attack going on onto an IP. So yeah, in this case, maybe it was done. But yeah, to note the network under attack, it was not actually /24, so it was a much larger network. So this was just a simple attack. We also noticed some high-profile attacks, and for these, we checked for how much of the IP space, of the announced IP space of networks is actually attacked. And we found rates between 10 to 28% of the IPs inside an announced network was attacked. And it seemed to be that this is more high-profile attacks because these targets were, for example, banks, insurance providers, and cloud providers. So third, in times of COVID, we also checked for if VPN infrastructures are at risk and attacked already. So we compiled a DNS dataset with VPN for endpoints, where we found 1.2 million unique VPN endpoints. And luckily, only 39 targets were attacked in this dataset. And this were from 30 different networks. If you are more interested, our full study features more interesting features and details about DDoS application attacks. Take a look into the paper and feel free to contact me or one of the co-authors. Thanks for joining this presentation, and I'm looking forward to continue discussion with you on this topic.
Daniel, thanks for the great talk. So as with the last paper, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A in WebEx. We also are in PAM 2021 session 6 on Slack. So please drop your questions there. So our first question is from Marcin, and he asks, is there any assumption on who is using these new attack vectors? Is it the same old bad guys with new attack tools, or are these new players in the DDoS scene?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Good question. So what we see from this paid booter service that you can just buy for a few dollars, now you can just buy like multiple, like you would say you want a mixed DDoS attack, and then you get different protocols. But they usually don't provide that new protocols like OpenVPN. So I think this is more for the more sophisticated attacks. So I don't really know who is using them, but as our study has like, we only have really high attack rates. So 1 gigabit on one destination is super high. So we also know there's many more lower attacks, but you can't be sure if this is really attacks. So yeah, they are still already happening and they are big, but I don't really know where they are coming from. Sorry. More research has to go into this, probably.
Just in general, I think DDoS DDoS attribution is not an easy question. While we're waiting for other questions to come in, I have a question. So I was looking at that temporal attack that graph that you were showing. I thought it was interesting. First off, that they were incrementing the addresses linearly as opposed to doing some sort of random permutation. But I was curious if that's an example of carpet bombing attacks that we saw in the last paper, or if there's something that makes it distinct.
Yeah, it's maybe it's an example like in the last paper. So I read the last paper, and I'm not 100% sure what they also describe carpet bombing in terms of that the attack can be traversed like in a timely basis. But I'm not sure what's their minimum, because they talk about days, like on the next day there will be another IP attacked. But what we see, it's like really a minute, like 1 minute, and then in the next minute, because I was wondering if this is an error in our data, but then it turned out, no, it's just really a 1 minute attack, and then 1 minute on the next IP address, and so on and so on. And if you pay really close attention in the plot, there are some small gaps that traverse really linear in this plot. So I can't really tell what's happening there, but it's also a really interesting insight. But we need more time to look into that probably. But yeah, it's like a carpet bombing attack, and maybe one addition to that, we were not really able, we were also really curious about carpet bombing attacks, and it was also one of my next ideas to look into that. But with our detection of DDoS, it really didn't really work, because we have this threshold of 1 gigabit. And if a bad guy has a DDoS with 1 gigabit and he spreads it over a /24 network, you end up with just like 40 megabits per IP address. So our per IP address approach doesn't really work anymore in that case. So yeah, so that's better for the honeypot. But overall, the comparison between honeypot and our data, because we have this flow data, and the honeypot, it works completely different. I mean, you wait for somebody to use the honeypot, and this is a really interesting comparison. And we also had honeypot data available at the end, really close to the deadline, and we only had a short glimpse into the data, and we really were seeing a totally different picture of. We saw some overlap just a little bit, but then a huge difference in what they see and what we see. And yeah, we think that's really depends on the location where you are in the internet, like if you are in Europe or if you are in Brazil. So it's really interesting to compare these two views. So yeah, maybe also more research has to go into that one.
I'm definitely looking forward to that next paper. I think that'll be interesting. We've got time for one last question from Moritz Müller, and he asks, did you actually look at the the DDoS mitigation strategies or services that are available to see if these 1 minute bursts are actually evading detection systems in the field?
So we didn't really check if the 1 minute attacks were evading detection tactics, but I'm pretty sure they are, because just shortly after that, I was seeing like a presentation of a security company, and then where they were telling or comparing the times they need to detect a DDoS attack compared to others. And it was really in the range of seconds to a minute or something. So if this helps, if you just hop to the next IP address and
the mitigation has to recognize the new attack again, and then you jump to the next IP address, then it might be really a problem for the mitigation software. So I'm pretty convinced that they do that to evade the mitigation strategies. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Well, thanks again for the interesting talk and interesting responses to interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Now it's time to turn our attention to the last paper of our session. And in the last two talks, we've been talking about distributed denial of service. And one of the themes is that, well, it's almost always DNS. As the joke goes. And so now in this talk, we're going to be looking more into DNS. And so this work is going to be presented by Jacob Davis. He's a master's student at Brigham Young University in Utah. And he's graduating this semester with his master's degree and will be moving on to Sandia National Laboratories. So let's see the presentation.
Hi, my name is Jacob, and today I'll be presenting our work on measuring DNS cookies. So to start, the domain name system, or DNS, is of course a key aspect of the internet used to convert domain names to IP addresses. And in our typical architecture, we'll start with a stub resolver, such as a laptop, which will ask a recursive resolver a query. And that recursive resolver will then ask a series of authoritative servers. So one thing to note here is that this creates two separate client and server pairs. And in most queries and responses are using UDP for transport. So UDP is fast, but it's also connectionless. And because UDP is connectionless, there's no mechanism to verify identity. So this creates two different attacks. In the first attack, known as cache poisoning, the attacker spoofs a response from a server pretending to be authoritative. So this results in the victim receiving a potentially malicious IP address as an answer. With denial of service attacks, the attacker spoofs queries appearing to be from the victim. They'll send these fake queries to thousands of servers, causing the victim to be overwhelmed with responses. In both of these cases, the attacker is off path, meaning they're not seeing a direct communication between the victim and server. So DNS cookies are one solution for providing identity management, and they exist as an option in the extended DNS or eDNS opt record. So these are standardized as an RFC in 2016. And essentially how it works is that a client will include a unique cookie in its query. And when a server responds, they will include that same client cookie as well as a server cookie that they have generated. So what this essentially does is that both parties can then verify the other by ensuring their own cookie is included when the other sends a message to them. And since our attacker is off path, they have no way of seeing these cookie values. So the first thing we wanted to do was to see how many clients and servers out there are using cookies right now. So to start, we're going to look at authoritative servers, and I have a little map in the bottom right for all the rest of these slides because we'll be jumping around to DNS a lot. So that can help you keep track. So for authoritative servers, we had our client query the servers for all of the TLDs, as well as all of the top 1 million Alexa sites. And what we found is that nearly every server supports eDNS, which, as I mentioned, eDNS support is required because cookies are an eDNS option. But then we saw that less than 30% of servers fully supported cookies. And by that, we mean that they responded with our client cookie as well as the server cookie that they had generated. Next, we looked at the server side of recursive resolvers. So to get our set of recursive resolvers, we sent queries to every IP in the IPv4 address space. And we're essentially checking if they behaved like resolvers. So was the recursion available flag set? Was the error code no error? Things like that. And we identified almost 2 million servers. Of those, 70% supported eDNS and 17% supported cookies. So a fair bit less than what we saw with authoritative servers. Finally, we wanted to look at recursive clients. So for those 2 million servers in the previous slide, our client queried them for a domain name that we controlled. So this caused them to query our authoritative servers, and we could then see if they included a cookie. So for this data set, we had under 100,000 servers. And at the time of this test, 1.5 million resolvers were still active. So this seems to imply that there's probably a large amount of forwarding going on to this smaller subset of true recursive resolvers. Regardless, what we found is that 9% sent us a query with a client cookie in it. So now we've seen how many clients and servers are using cookies. And next we want to ask, well, how many people are enforcing cookies? And what we mean by that is anyone actually gaining that identity management aspect of cookies by rejecting messages in certain scenarios? So we'll first look at our recursive clients, which we had around 29,000 of. And what we'll do is we'll begin by having them query our authoritative servers normally to establish that we support cookies, right? So they'll query us with a client cookie, we respond with a client cookie as well as a server cookie, just like normal. After that, we would customize our server's response to elicit different behaviors from the client. What we found is that around 85% of clients behave normally when our server stopped including EDNS or stopped including cookies. However, only 20% would accept if we sent a incorrect client cookie. Only 20% would accept our message. So what this means is that more than 80% of clients that use cookies are still susceptible to that cache poisoning attack that I mentioned at the beginning, right? So the attacker can just send a spoofed response and clients will accept it, regardless of whether there's a cookie or not. And to make matters worse, the RFC specifically states that they must discard these queries since they should be expecting our response to contain a cookie. So not only is this an unsafe practice, but it's also violating the RFC. So similarly, we looked at enforcement in recursive and authoritative servers. And here what we did is we queried the servers with our client, and we even included a real server cookie that we had previously obtained from them. And then we wouldn't include a cookie, and then we would include an incorrect cookie. And so the specification gives servers 3 different options for how to behave. They're ordered here from most to least restrictive. And what we found is that more than 99% of servers implement the least restrictive approach, which is just to respond normally. So what this means is that pretty much every server, regardless of whether they're using cookies or not, can still be used for a denial of service attack, because the attacker can just send a normal query spoofing the victim, and the server will go ahead and respond to that victim. So we've seen that very few clients and servers are enforcing cookies. So finally, we wanted to think of some ways that this could be improved. So for client enforcement, which is used to prevent cache poisoning, it's pretty straightforward. For the most part, clients should follow the RFC and enforce cases where they should be expecting cookies. Of course, server configurations could change, but there should be some reasonable expectation as a server that is using cookies will continue to do so. It's also not as big of a deal for clients because there's other methods such as 0x20 encoding and source port randomization, which are effective in preventing cache poisoning. So cookies aren't the only solution in this space. On the server side, it's difficult to determine if a client intends to support cookies, right? Just because a client sends a cookie once doesn't mean they always will, and vice versa. And a great example of this is a NATed network where one client behind a NAT could send a cookie while none of the other clients are. So one solution that we suggest is that clients could advertise their intent to use cookies in a reverse DNS zone using text records. Servers could then check for these advertisements and enforce what they see. In summary, the DNS is vulnerable to identity management attacks, such as cache poisoning and denial of service. DNS cookies are a standardized mechanism to mitigate these attacks. So we were the first people to measure adoption of DNS cookies, and we found that around 30% of servers and 10% of recursive clients were using them. However, we found that very few clients or servers were actually enforcing cookies, and as a result, those identity management attacks still exist, even for those who have adopted cookies. And our proposed solution, which we leave to future work, is a mechanism for clients to advertise their use of cookies. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob, for that great presentation. Now is a great time for you to drop your questions either in the Q&A or in Slack under the session 6 channel. We have a question for you already, Jacob, from Shane Kerr. He asks if you did any breakdown of DNS cookie support on the big public resolvers, like Google, Cloudflare, those folks, versus just your generic open resolvers out on the internet, which almost by definition are poorly maintained.
Yeah, so we did not specifically look at open resolvers. that would have been something useful to do from the client perspective to see if they're protecting themselves from cache poisoning. But from the server perspective, where we're concerned about DDoS attacks, it doesn't necessarily matter too much specifically if they're supporting cookies, because an attacker could still utilize those poorly maintained servers.
That's an interesting point. I think we've got another question coming in. Just to follow up on that question, looking in your data anecdotally, did you see a difference between, the big providers? Or, I know that you can't speak to something authoritatively because you didn't actually do the study, but.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't specifically recall like anything, but yeah, there's just too many IP addresses that I wasn't personally like picking out the big names.
Yeah, that when you do large measurement studies like this, getting your head around the data can be overwhelming. So I think we still have one more question coming in, but while we're waiting, so you mentioned that in future work, perhaps you could take a look at having clients announce that they support cookies. Um, could have you? I'm curious. It sounds like that would be a solution, sort of like HSTS, if I understand your proposal correctly. What kind of state would that require on the DNS server?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with HSTS, but in general, the idea would be that servers would essentially check for these records when receiving queries and see whether or not the incoming query conforms to whatever that record states.
So we've got a question from Mark Allman, who asked, how would the reverse DNS idea help in the NAT case?
Yeah, so dealing with NATs in general is really tricky. But the idea would be that if you have like a single organization that controls their own reverse DNS zone, they could then add this record and then hopefully, have enough control over their own network that they could, manage like including cookies outside of it, like at their recursive resolver level or at their client level. So it's not necessarily, it wouldn't be intended for, like individual use cases. It would be at the organizational level.
Great. So we've got another question from Audrey Randall. This one, this is an interesting question. She asks, if open resolvers are often misconfigured and just shouldn't be accessible from the rest of the internet, shouldn't we just try to make them inaccessible to fix that inherent vulnerability rather than trying to fix their cookie support?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be the ideal solution. As we know, a majority of these resolvers probably aren't even supposed to be resolvers. So yeah, that's definitely the proper route to go.
And she provides a follow-up comment in parentheses. I realize that's not easy.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. We've got another question from Ulrich Visser, who asks, why would a client need to indicate cookie support through reverse DNS? Shouldn't it be enough to send a query including a client cookie?
Yeah, so again, that goes back to natted networks. So, right, a server can't definitively say if a client includes a cookie one time that that client is actually using cookies, because it could be just an individual client behind a NAT. Another issue is, say an attacker starts spoofing queries without cookies. Well, so now the server's seeing one query with a cookie, but a bunch without. And so it gets kind of confusing.
Yeah, that um, I feel like NAT ends up being the root of most network security problems, or
Yeah.
or most network security solutions, I guess, uh, complicating it. That looks like all the questions. So thanks to Jacob and all of our speakers for providing a great session. Thanks to those of you who asked questions. I encourage you, if you found something interesting, feel free to reach out to the authors in the session Slack channel. But otherwise, enjoy the upcoming coffee break that begins at the end of the session. There's a link to that WebEx in the chat for this WebEx. And so have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.